You do not look like someone anyone would leave behind. And yet here you are. The wind cut like a blade when the train doors groaned open onto the platform at Red Bluff. Marin Whitlow stepped down into a world that did not seem to have a place for her. The train hissed behind her, its heat already fading, leaving behind cold metal and colder air. Her boots sank slightly into the gritty snow that had half melted and refrozen in the high desert chill. She held a carpet bag in one hand and a crumpled telegram in the other. 12 words that had changed the shape of her life without so much as a period at the end. Arrangement canceled. Circumstances changed. Regret any inconvenience. Jeremiah Crow. Not even signed properly. No apology. No explanation. Just cold ink like everything else in this place. Around her, the small depot buzzed with motion. Ranchers with red cheeks and flannel coats gathered parcels. Children chased each other through the legs of their mothers, shrieking and laughing in the blue-gold light of late afternoon. Somewhere someone played a fiddle off-key. The air smelled of wood smoke and train grease, of oranges and dust. It smelled like someone else's life. Marin stood still, forgotten luggage in a tide of reunion. She tried to decide whether she should scream or disappear. She had come here for a man she had never met, a man who had promised marriage in a 2-page letter. He offered her a home and security in exchange for companionship on his cattle ranch. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. She had not expected love or even kindness. She had expected safety. Now even that was gone. She tucked the telegram deep into the lining of her coat and pulled her threadbare shawl tighter across her shoulders. The wind caught her skirt and bit through the thin wool, numbing her knees. There were 17 cents in her purse. The ticket back to Pennsylvania would cost at least $40. She did not even have enough to stay the night in a room, and she could not go back. Not after what she had run from. Not after the last time her uncle's son had cornered her in the pantry and her aunt had pretended not to see. That life was over. But this was no beginning. The platform emptied slowly. One by one, families disappeared into wagons and buggies, headed toward houses filled with firelight and holiday songs. She was the last one left standing. A station worker glanced at her as he shuttered the ticket window. He gave a small nod of sympathy. Then he turned the key in the door behind him. The sound echoed. Marin picked up her bag. Her knuckles were white against the worn leather handle. She had no plan, only instinct. An instinct said move. She walked through the heart of town, past windows lit with candles and pine garlands. The smell of roasting meat made her stomach cramp so hard she had to stop, bend slightly, breathe through her teeth. She had not eaten since a biscuit and half an apple on the train the day before. She had saved the rest in case of emergency. She supposed this counted. She stopped outside a boarding house, a wooden sign swinging faintly in the wind. Rooms available. Weekly rates. She stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a hand across the face. Too much at first, then not enough. The woman at the front desk glanced up. Not unfriendly, but firm. It is $4 a week. Pay in advance, Marin swallowed. Do you offer a night's rate? No, ma'am. Not during Christmas week. Marin nodded, thanked her, and left before she had to explain why 17 cents was not going to cut it. Outside, twilight had settled in. A thin layer of frost crept up the windows of the town. Voices echoed from a nearby church where children practiced hymns. Marin kept walking, past the edge of downtown, toward nothing in particular. The snow had started again, soft, slow, silent. Then out of nowhere, the scent hit her. Meat, butter, bread. She turned and found herself standing in front of a place called the Iron Pot, a squat, warm-lit restaurant with fogged-up windows and a closed sign hanging crooked in the glass. Inside, a man sat alone eating. She did not mean to stare, but she could not look away. A plate of steak, potatoes, steam still curling in the air above it. The man cut each bite with care, ate slowly, deliberately. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with tan skin and long, dark brown hair tucked behind his ears. His hat was pushed back on his head. His clothes were dusty but well kept. The kind of practical worn-out that comes from real work, not neglect. She must have leaned too far toward the glass. Or maybe the movement of her breath against the cold pane gave her away. Because he looked up. Their eyes met. Her first instinct was shame. She turned quickly, ready to disappear into the growing dark. But before she could take a step, the door swung open behind her. "You waiting on someone?" His voice was low, steady, no pity in it, just a question. Marin turned slowly. "No," she said, because it was the truth. The man studied her for a moment, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior. "They are closing, but there is food. Kitchen made too much like always. You hungry?" She hesitated. "I do not have money," she said. "Did not ask if you did." He nodded toward the counter. "Name is Caleb. Inside is Big Tom. Tell him I said to bring out the extra plate." Marin stood still, pride warred with hunger. But pride did not fill your belly, and it sure as anything did not keep you warm. And there was something about his tone, not soft, not hard, just matter of fact, like kindness was just a piece of the world, not a charity. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and turned back to his table without another word. Marin stepped inside the iron pot. The heat wrapped around her like a wool blanket left near a fire. Too much at first, but then just right. Her fingers tingled. Her jaw trembled. Big Tom looked up from behind the counter. He was a large man with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "Caleb says you get a plate." She nodded. "Please sit anywhere." She chose the table nearest the stove. Not too close to the man who had offered, but not far either. Within minutes, a plate appeared. Beef steak, glazed carrots, potatoes, and half a loaf of bread. She stared at it for a moment, afraid to touch it. Then she ate, slowly at first, then faster. Across the room, Caleb ate in silence. He did not watch her, did not make her feel observed, just let her be. When the plate was clean, Big Tom brought her a cup of coffee without asking. She wrapped her hands around it like it was made of gold. "Thank you," she said. Tom shrugged. "He paid for it. I just cooked it." She turned toward Caleb. He did not look up. "I will repay you," she said quietly, "when I can." He took a sip of his own coffee. Eyes steady. "No need." A long silence passed between them. "We all stumble at some point." Marin sipped her coffee, unsure what comes next. No money, no place to sleep, no plan. Caleb finished his drink, then asked a simple question that would change everything. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" She shook her head. "A full plate does not mean much if you eat it alone." He stood, picked up his hat from the chair beside him, nodded toward the door. "Come on," he said simply. Marin hesitated, fingers still curled around her coffee cup. She looked at Big Tom. He offered her a tired but warm smile, as if to say, "It is all right. Go ahead." She wrapped her scarf back around her neck and followed Caleb outside into the bitter air. The wind had settled, but the cold had deepened, a still cutting kind of cold that sank into your joints and made your thoughts brittle. They walked down Main Street without speaking. Most of the shops had closed. Candles glowed behind frosted windows. Wreaths hung crooked on weather-beaten doors. From a small chapel up the hill, voices rose in halting harmony. Someone's children practicing for the Christmas Eve service. It might have been beautiful, if it had not felt like it belonged to a life Maureen had stepped out of long ago. "You said your name is Marin?" Caleb asked after a block or so. She nodded. "Marin Whitlow. You from the East?" "Pennsylvania, near Scranton." He did not comment, just nodded like that told him what he needed. After another few moments, he added, "Red Bluff is not much, but it is quieter than most towns this side of the canyon. Safer, too. Most days." They turned down a narrow lane lit by a single street lamp and the faint shimmer of starlight reflecting on fresh snow. The houses here were smaller, closer together. Wood smoke poured from chimneys in soft plumes. The sharp tang of juniper and ash clung to the air. "Leona Nez lives just up this road," Caleb said, his voice low. "She runs a rooming house of sorts, takes in women passing through, does not ask too many questions. Her girl's about 6. You would get a bed, meals, and work to earn it." Marin bit the inside of her cheek. "Why are you helping me?" He stopped walking, turned to look at her fully for the first time. His face was calm, unreadable. "Because someone helped me once. Did not ask why I was broken. Just gave me a place to catch my breath." He did not say anything else, just kept walking. Marin followed, unsure how to respond to that kind of honesty. It felt like stepping into a deeper kind of silence. Not empty, but watchful. The house came into view. 2 stories. Yellow siding worn pale by sun and dust. A bright red door with a wreath made of dried sage and ribbon. Warm light glowed from the front window. Someone was humming inside. Not a song, just a sound of comfort. The hum of someone washing up dishes after dinner. Caleb knocked twice. Firm, but not loud. After a pause, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the frame, wearing a navy skirt and an apron dusted with flour. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, streaks of gray woven through dark brown. "Evening, Leona," Caleb said. "Caleb Yazzie," she replied, eyebrows raised slightly. "I did not expect you tonight. This is Marin Whitlow," he said. "She came in on the train, no place to go. Thought maybe you had a room and a warm bed." Leona studied Marin with quiet, steady eyes. "You running from something?" "No," Marin said. "I was running towards something. It just was not there when I arrived." Leona gave a single knowing nod, then opened the door wider. "Come on in. Mind the rug. Dog tracks from this morning have not dried yet." Inside, the house was small but warm, thick with the smells of cinnamon stew and firewood. A little girl sat at a low table coloring with a stub of charcoal, her small feet swinging above the floor. She looked up with curiosity as Marin stepped in. "That is Tally," Leona said. "She is shy at first, but talks your ear off once she trusts you." Marin offered a small wave. Tally narrowed her eyes, assessing, like a wary kitten, then nodded once and returned to her drawing. Caleb stepped inside only long enough to remove his hat and set Marin's carpet bag just inside the door. "She will pull her weight," he told Leona, "and she is hungry." But she did not ask for anything. Leona's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Then she will fit right in." She turned to Marin. "Come on, I have got leftover stew and a bed with clean sheets." Caleb tipped his hat again, then turned to leave. "Wait," Marin said without meaning to. He paused, looking back. "I did not thank you. You do not owe me anything," he said. "A full plate does not mean much if you eat it alone." And with that, he stepped into the snow, the door closing gently behind him. Dinner was eaten at the kitchen table with a spoon too big for the bowl, in a silence Marin did not mind. The stew was thick with barley, turnips, and something smoky and tender that might have been venison. It tasted like the kind of food made in big pots. Food meant to last, to comfort, to keep people alive through winter. Leona sat across from her, mending a shirt with a needle so fine Marin could barely see the thread. She did not ask questions, did not pry. Just let Marin eat and breathe and exist. When the bowl was empty, Tally appeared at her elbow. "Do you read?" the girl asked. "Yes, then you can stay. Mama only lets people stay who read stories before bed." Leona raised an eyebrow. "Is that true?" "Mostly," Tally said, not looking away from Marin. So Marin read. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the small bed in the second room upstairs, holding a book so worn the cover was barely clinging to the spine. It was a collection of fairy tales, and she read about a girl who tricked a wolf and a boy who stole fire from the sky. Tally leaned close, smelling of soap and dust, and fell asleep somewhere between the second and third story. Later, lying in the small bed Leona had offered, Marin stared at the ceiling. It was warmer than she expected. The walls creaked with old age, but there was something solid about them. Something lived in, a place with memory. She thought about Caleb, about the way he had not looked away when she met his eyes, about how he had carried her bag without asking, and about that strange line of his, spoken like a proverb he did not claim to own. "A full plate does not mean much if you eat it alone." Marin turned her face into the pillow and exhaled. She had not eaten alone tonight, and that meant something, even if she was not sure what yet. Some doors do not open because you knock. They open because someone is still up waiting. The next morning came too quickly. Marin woke to the smell of wood smoke and something warm baking. Biscuits maybe, or cornbread. For a moment she did not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was slanted. The walls faded yellow with water stains that looked like the shape of clouds. She was still fully clothed, her shawl tangled around her like a second skin. Then she heard voices downstairs. Low, gentle, familiar. She sat up slowly. Her muscles ached from travel, from tension, from whatever she had been carrying across state lines in years of her life. She washed her face with cold water from a basin by the window and smoothed her hair as best she could with her fingers. When she stepped into the kitchen, Leona was bent over the stove, flipping something in a cast-iron pan. Tally sat cross-legged near the hearth, humming to herself as she carved at a piece of wood with a dull butter knife. "You slept late," Leona said. "Not unkindly. I did not think I would sleep at all. First real sleep in weeks will do that to you." Marin nodded, unsure how to respond. She offered to set the table, and Leona nodded toward a drawer. It was the quiet kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken. They ate together, biscuits with honey, eggs cooked hard, chicory coffee that made Marin wince but finished the cup anyway. There was something about eating with people who did not expect conversation that made the food taste better. As Marin stood to clear the plates, a knock sounded at the door. Leona looked up but did not move. "That will not be for me." Marin opened it. No one stood outside, but a folded envelope had been slipped beneath the frame. The name was written in a jagged, unfamiliar scroll. Miss Marin Whitlow, bride of Jeremiah Crow. Her chest tightened. She stared at it for a long second before picking it up. Leona set down her mug. "Go on, open it. Might as well know." Marin sat back down, hands trembling slightly, and peeled the seal open. Inside was a single page, carefully folded. She read it once, through her eyes scanning faster than her brain could keep up. Then again, slower. "Dear Miss Whitlow, I pray this finds you in time, though I fear it will not. My brother Jeremiah was thrown from his horse and struck his head on the rocks near the South Ridge. He lingered for 3 days and passed in the early morning of the 4th. Among his things, I found your letters and the engagement agreement. I regret to inform you that his message, if he sent one, was likely short. My grief was not kind to my judgment. I can only hope if you have made it to Red Bluff, someone there has shown you some kindness. Sincerely, Margaret Crow." She folded the letter slowly, carefully, as if pressing it small enough might reduce the weight of it. Her hands settled in her lap. Her breath felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. "He is dead," she said quietly. Tally looked up from the floor. Leona did not move. "The man I came to marry died before the telegram ever reached me." No one answered for a long moment. Even the stove seemed to hush itself. "Did you love him?" Leona asked. Marin gave a short, breathless laugh. "I did not even know him. We wrote letters. He offered a place. I accepted. That is all." Leona nodded. "So you did not lose a man. You lost a plan." Marin blinked, surprised at how accurate that was. "Yes," she whispered. "That is exactly what I lost." Leona stood and reached for the kettle. Losing a plan can hurt worse than losing a person. Sometimes you mourn what might have been. Marin stared into her empty coffee cup. She had come to Red Bluff carrying hope disguised as practicality. A plan so bare bones it barely counted as a dream. But she had clung to it anyway, because it was something. Now she had nothing. And yet not quite nothing. There was a roof over her head, a child who listened to her stories, a woman who let her stay without prying, and Caleb. She did not know what to make of him yet, but his presence had felt solid, like something you could lean against without fear it might break. Later that afternoon, while folding linens in their back room, Leona spoke again. Unprompted, "I do not usually take in strays." Marin glanced up. "But you did not come to the door looking for pity," Leona continued. "You look like someone who would knock once and walk away if it did not open." Marin set down the pillowcase she was folding. "Some doors do not open because you knock," she said, almost to herself. "They open because someone is still up waiting." Leona looked at her for a long second and nodded once. "That is right." They did not talk more after that. That night, Marin read to Tally again. The girl pressed curling her small hands into the hem of Marin's skirt like she belonged there, like she had been doing it forever. Marin paused between stories, listening to the wind rattle the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, then quiet. She looked down at the child beside her. "Do you ever miss your father?" she asked gently. Tally did not open her eyes. "No, he went away before I could remember him. Mama says sometimes men leave before they are ever really here." Marin did not know what to say to that. so she just kept reading. Downstairs, Leona was sewing again, her needle tapping through fabric in a rhythm that sounded like rain. The fire snapped. The walls breathed. And upstairs, Marin realized this was not the life she had expected, but maybe it could become the one she chose. She was settling into bed when a knock echoed through the house. Sharp, deliberate, late. Leona called up the stairs. "Marin, it is for you." Her chest tightened. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and padded downstairs, bare feet cold against the floor. Caleb stood at the door, hat in hand, dust on his coat despite the snow. "I was nearby," he said. "It is late." "I know." He hesitated, eyes steady. "I wanted to see if you were still here." Marin searched his face. "I am." He exhaled, like something had been quietly held too long. Good. They stood like that, neither quite inside nor out. "I got a letter," she said. "Finally. He is dead." Caleb nodded once. "I figured. I do not know what to do now. You do not have to decide tonight." She nodded, suddenly so tired her bones ached. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "If you want." She almost smiled. "I think I do." He tipped his hat and turned back into the night. The next morning, word spread through Red Bluff that someone had been asking around town about the Crow Bride, and this someone was not here to offer condolences. Sister Miriam knocked at Leona's door with something unexpected. A warning. Elias is not just here to clean up paperwork. He has been asking around town about Marin's reputation. Leona's jaw tightened. A man can ruin you in this town with nothing but a whisper and a cup of coffee. Marin felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She had known this kind of threat before, back in Pennsylvania, in the way her aunt's husband's sons could corner her in a hallway with nothing more than a smile, the way people could look the other way if the right man said the right thing first. Now it had followed her all the way west, in a nicer coat, with better manners, but no less dangerous. "Who is Elias?" Marin asked. Sister Miriam set down her coffee cup. "Jeremiah's cousin. He handles the estate, or claims to. Word is he has been making inquiries, suggesting you are not who you say you are. That maybe you came here for more than marriage." Leona leaned forward. "What kind of more?" "The kind that involves land, money, inheritance." Marin's stomach turned. "I do not want any of that. I just wanted a place to live." Sister Miriam nodded. "I believe you, but belief does not stop rumors." That afternoon, Marin walked into town with Leona. They visited the seamstress, the butcher, the store. She made small talk with Ruth Fenley, smiled politely at the Harper boys, and stood a little taller than she had the day before. Let them see her. Let them wonder what kind of woman showed up in the snow and did not run when men started whispering. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, Marin returned home to find Caleb leaning against the front porch railing, dust on his boots, arms crossed, like he had been waiting a while. "You look tired," he said. "I feel worse." He studied her a moment. "He is talking everywhere." Marin nodded. "He tried to buy my place once," Caleb said. "Made it sound like charity. I told him no. Next week I had 3 missing fence posts and a neighbor who would not look me in the eye. Why is he like this? Because men like him do not understand when someone says no." Marin stepped up onto the porch. "And what do you do with a man like that?" Caleb looked out toward the horizon. "You do not let him see you flinch." Marin sat beside him. The quiet settled between them like a blanket. "He is not just trying to erase me," she said. "He is trying to stain me, make me untrustworthy, so he does not have to pay me or respect me." Caleb nodded. "Then do not fight him on his terms." She looked over. "What does that mean?" "Live like he already lost. Be seen. Be steady. Be someone this town cannot deny." The church bell rang once, low and far off, muffled by the morning fog that blanketed Red Bluff in a hush. It was the day of the Christmas Eve gathering at the chapel. Marin stood at the wash basin, tying the back of Tally's dress while the little girl squirmed in protest. "It is scratchy," Tally whined. "All the best dresses are," Marin said, forcing a small smile. "Now stand still before we both miss the start." The whole town was expected at the chapel by noon. For some, it was tradition. For others, it was survival. Food, firelight, a place to be seen, to feel counted. They walked to the church together. Red Bluff had gathered in full. The chapel glowed with lanterns, and inside the warmth was nearly overwhelming. Someone played a fiddle near the pulpit. Children clustered near tables of sticky buns and pies, eyes wide with sugar-laced excitement. Marin stood near the edge of the room, scanning faces she barely knew. Then she saw him, tall, clean-shaven in a way most men out here did not bother with. His coat was black and fine, no wear on the seams. He stood beside the offering box, speaking to the preacher, with a tilt of confidence that made her skin crawl. She did not know his name, but she knew the type. As if sensing her stare, the man turned. His eyes landed on her with slow calculation. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not friendly, not cruel, just sure. He crossed the room like he had already bought it. "Miss Whitlow," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. "I hope to find you." Marin did not return the smile. "You have me at a disadvantage. Elias Crow, Jeremiah's cousin." He paused. "Executor of his estate." Leona stepped up beside her like a shadow, calm but present. "I was told Jeremiah and I had no formal contract," Marin said, voice steady, "and that he passed before I arrived." Elias nodded solemnly. "Tragic, sudden. But yes, the engagement was known among the family. Your name is in his journal, several entries, and the arrangement was understood." "Understood? By whom?" Elias tilted his head. "Enough people to matter. The Crow name carries weight, Miss Whitlow. So does its inheritance." Marin felt the edges of the room closing in. She heard Tally's laughter somewhere behind her, Leona's breath at her side, the murmur of conversations blending into a low hum. "What is it you want?" Elias smiled, like a man stepping into a trap he had laid himself. "Only to clarify a few things. You arrived under the intention of marriage. If that is true, then certain property discussions might include your name." Leona narrowed her eyes. She was not a wife, no, but she might have been, and if she makes that claim or someone else does, things get messy. Marin felt cold despite the heat of the room. "So you are here to offer a bribe?" Elias did not flinch. "I am here to make sure my family's estate is not tarnished by ambiguity. If you sign a document confirming there was no binding agreement, we will compensate you for your time. Travel disruption." "How much?" $200. Leona made a low sound in her throat. Marin looked Elias dead in the eye. "If I was good enough to marry into your family, I am good enough to be part of the story after. You do not get to erase me." His tone hardened. "This is not personal. It is legal." She took a step forward. If she was promised to him, then what he owned is hers, or owes her. The words came from behind her. "Caleb." He stood at the back of the chapel, arms folded, boots dusty, eyes sharp. The crowd had quieted just enough for his voice to carry. Not loud, just firm. Elias turned toward him. "And you are?" "Someone who knows the difference between decency and paperwork." The silence between them was taut. Then Elias straightened his coat. "This is not the place." "No," Caleb said, "it is not." Elias turned to Marin. "I will be staying at the boarding house on Main for 2 more days. After that, the offer closes." He walked away with the same arrogance he arrived with. People watched him go, then watched her. Marin suddenly felt exposed in front of all of them, but she did not cry, did not speak, just breathed. Later outside, the sun dipped toward the ridge, casting long golden light over the snow. "I did not ask you to speak for me," she said to Caleb as he walked beside her. "I know," she looked at him, "but I am glad you did." They walked in silence a few paces more. I'm not taking their money," she said. "I did not think you would." Marin stopped and looked up at the church, its silhouette dark against the sky. "I came here to become someone else. Now they are offering to pay me to disappear. And what do you want?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she watched Tally race ahead, kicking snow into the air. "I do not know," she said finally, "but it is not that." Caleb nodded, like that was enough. The morning of the winter market broke gray and sharp, the kind of cold that snapped at your cheeks before the sun even climbed past the ridge. Red Bluff was already stirring when Marin and Leona stepped onto the street, arms full of cloth-wrapped loaves and bundles of dried herbs to trade. Tally skipped ahead in her green mittens, chasing her own breath like it was a game. Marin walked slowly, scanning the town square as it came alive. Tables unfolded in front of the general store, baskets filled with winter apples, skeins of wool, jars of preserved peaches, and pots of lard rendered thick from early butchering. The smell of fresh bread and sawdust hung in the air. She did not think she would be nervous. But now, standing in the center of town, her heart thudded harder than she expected. People were polite, some smiled, most nodded, but none lingered, and all of them looked twice at her. Leona set their table beside Ruth Fenley's preserves and began laying out the loaves. Marin worked silently, hands steady, but cold. She heard it as she turned toward the second basket. "She is the one, right?" someone whispered. Not low enough. The Crow bride. No, not bride, just the almost. Marin's jaw tensed. "They look at me," she said under her breath, "like I am a secret no one agreed to keep." Leona did not look up from arranging the honey cakes. Let them. It is not just the looks. It is the pause in their voice. Like I owe them a story they are too polite to ask for. You do not owe them anything, but I live here now, and they are trying to decide if I am the kind of woman who belongs or the kind they warn their daughters about. Leona straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. You do not change their minds with words. You change them by staying put and staying true. Marin exhaled slowly and forced her hands to keep working. By midday, the crowd thickened. Hank DeVoe stopped by with a crooked smile and two hand-carved whistles for Tally. The girl grinned wide and gave him a hug that nearly knocked him off his feet. Leona's eyes flickered soft for half a second before she turned back to the table. Big Tom brought over 2 mugs of mulled cider and a tin of biscuits. "Figured you two could use a little heat," he said, handing them off with a wink. "No one gossips louder than a cold stomach." Marin sipped hers gratefully. The warmth ran through her chest, grounding her. She was just starting to relax when a familiar voice drifted from behind her. "Cannot say I blame the girl," the woman said. "A man like Jeremiah Crow with land like that, who would not want to say they belong to him?" Marin turned slowly, Ruth Fenley, talking to Mrs. Harper and one of the younger store clerks. "She is standing 10 feet away," Marin said aloud. "Clear and even." The women startled, turning to face her. "Miss Whitlow," Ruth said. "Too sweet. I did not realize." "You did not need to," Marin said. "But since you are speaking about me, I will save you the trouble. No, I did not get a ring. Yes, I came here to marry him. No, I did not know he was dead. And no, I am not leaving. Anything else you would like to know, you can ask me directly." A long pause stretched between them. Then Ruth smiled, small and tight. "I am sure you are doing the best you can." Marin nodded. "I am." She turned and walked back to the table, hands shaking slightly. Leona handed her a warm hand pie without a word. "I thought I could ignore it," Marin said quietly. "Thought if I smiled enough, they would forget I do not fit." "They do not want you to forget," Leona replied. "They want you to earn your place, and if I never do, then we keep showing up anyway." A breeze kicked up, scattering dried leaves across the square. Marin pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then a shadow passed across the table. Caleb. He wore a clean shirt and a coat with one button missing. His hair was pulled back a little neater than usual. In his hands were 2 wooden crates, one full of squash, the other holding a tightly coiled rope and 2 bags of feed. "Thought I would stop by," he said, setting the crates gently at their feet. "Brought some trade." Leona smirked. "You are about 3 hours late. I am not here for commerce," he said, looking at Marin. Her face warmed in the cold. "You did not have to come. I wanted to be seen," he said quietly, "standing next to you." Marin blinked once, steadying herself. "Then stand here," he did. And when a few heads turned, they did not speak. They did not look away, either. The rest of the day passed with fewer whispers. Or maybe Marin just stopped listening. As the market wound down, Caleb offered to carry the empty baskets. Marin hesitated. "Walk me back." Of course, they walked slowly, letting the cold stretch their silence. Tally ran ahead to chase chickens that had escaped a nearby coop. Leona trailed behind, talking with Hank. "You did not have to stand with me today," Marin said softly. "I know, but you did. I wanted to be clear about what I see." She glanced at him. "And what do you see?" "A woman who did not ask or rescue, but built something anyway." Marin looked away, heart knocking against her ribs. As they neared the house, he paused. I have got to get back before sundown. Livestock do not care about markets. She smiled. Thanks for today. He nodded once and turned away. Back inside, Marin helped Tally out of her boots. Her fingers still cold from the walk. Leona set the kettle on the stove and looked over her shoulder. You gonna let him keep showing up like that without saying what you want? Marin shook her head. I do not know what I want. Leona poured the water into 3 mugs, her voice calm. You better figure it out before someone else decides for you. Later that night, as Marin lay in bed, she thought about Caleb beside her at the market, about the way the town looked at her. Not all kindly, not yet, but not the same as before. Progress. Slow, but real. The wind changed first, a sharp shift that made the chickens restless and pushed the smoke from Leona's chimney sideways. The sky clear that morning had turned the color of tarnished metal by noon. Marin stood on the back porch, drying her hands with her apron, watching the horizon buckle under low clouds. Inside, Tally's voice rose and fell, singing a made-up tune as she dressed her rag doll in scraps of cloth. Leona was kneading dough at the table, her shoulders set in rhythm, eyes focused, but mind somewhere else. I do not like that sky, Marin said. Leona did not look up. Storm is coming. I thought we were not due for snow until Tuesday. Does not ask permission. The weather just shows up when it is ready. Marin turned back toward the yard, feeling uneasy. Something about the quiet did not feel like peace. It felt hollow. Tally ran past a moment later, chasing the cat out the door, feet flying fast in mismatched socks. Do not go far. Marin called after her. You hear? Just to the barn, Tally called over her shoulder. The door creaked shut behind her. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Leona noticed it first. Where is that girl? Marin stood abruptly. She said the barn. Leona wiped her hands, already reaching for her shawl. Go, I will check behind the house. Marin pulled on her boots, heart rising into her throat. She ran toward the barn, the snow just starting to spit from the sky. Light stinging flakes. Tally, she called. You out here? No answer. The barn door creaked open under her hand. Inside, it was still and quiet. The air smelled of hay dust and old wood. But no Tally. Panic punched through her chest. She turned and ran back toward the house, breath catching in her throat. Leona met her halfway, eyes wild. Nothing, Leona said. She is not behind the house. I checked the coop. The root cellar? Nothing. She could have followed the cat, Marin said, down toward the tree line. Leona's face went pale. Not with that storm rolling in. The wind picked up, driving snow sideways now. Fast, sharp, relentless. They ran back to the porch, grabbing coats and scarves, yelling her name into the wind. And then Marin said it out loud. She is lost. Leona did not flinch. She is not gone. We just cannot see her yet. They split up. Marin took the northern path toward the old logging road. Leona toward the trading post ruins, but the storm grew faster than their search. Within half an hour, visibility dropped to feet. The wind howled through the trees, white out, swallowing the horizon. Marin pushed forward, her breath ragged, scarf soaked through. Every branch looked like a silhouette, every snowdrift like a child curled up. And then a shadow moved ahead. A horse. Rider. Caleb. He came into view like he had been carved from the storm itself. Coat heavy with snow, reins gripped tight, his eyes locked on hers. I saw your tracks, he said, dismounting quickly. What happened? Tally, she gasped. She ran out and did not come back. Caleb did not waste time. Get on, he said, motioning to the horse. We will check the old post ruins. There is a crawl space there. If she found it, she will be out of the wind. They rode without speaking, Marin holding tight to his waist, snow slicing across her cheeks. The cold was no longer sharp. It was dull, creeping under her skin, numbing her edges. They reached the ruins, remnants of a half-buried trading post, stone foundation with wooden beams long since collapsed. Caleb jumped down first, pulling a small lantern from his saddlebag and lighting it under the coat to shield the flame. He crouched low, then froze. She is here, he said. I see her. Marin scrambled down behind him. Tally lay curled in a corner beneath a sloped beam, her arms around the cat, her lips blue. Marin dropped to her knees. Tally, baby, wake up. The girl stirred. Barely. Cannot feel my fingers, she murmured. Caleb scooped her up, wrapping her in his coat. We need to get her warm fast. Marin held the cat close, tucking it under her shawl, then mounted behind Caleb, cradling Tally's head as he urged the horse back through the storm. They reached the house half frozen. Leona met them at the porch, sobbing once, sharp and short, before pulling Tally inside. They stripped the girl of her wet clothes, wrapped her in quilts by the fire, and set stones to warm beside her. Caleb knelt beside the girl, rubbing her hands gently, his brow furrowed. She will be all right, he said quietly. She is strong. Marin sat beside him, her hands trembling. She almost died, but she did not. She could have. She did not, he repeated, firmer this time. Marin looked at him then, really looked. His face was windburned, lips cracked from the cold, snow still clinging to the fringe of his collar. But his eyes were steady, grounded. A child alone in this cold will not make it through the night, she said softly. You did not let her stay alone. Neither of them moved for a long while. Later, after Tally drifted into a shallow, steady sleep, Marin stood and took Caleb's hand. You saved her. He shook his head. You did. I just helped. Still, they stood in the kitchen afterward, hands wrapped around mugs of hot tea. I lost my wife in a storm, Caleb said suddenly. 3 years ago. Fever came on fast. We were snowed in. I could not get help in time. Marin said nothing. I made peace with the fact I cannot save people, he continued, but it does not mean I will stop trying. Marin reached across the table, fingers brushing his. You did good today. So did you. They sat in silence after that, the kind that does not need filling. 2 days later, with the storm past and Tally recovering, Caleb returned, not with questions or comfort, but with a proposition. Work on his ranch come spring, honest wages, no strings. But the offer felt like more than just work, and Marin had to decide what she was really building here. Sometimes what you need is not rescue, it is room to grow. The snow had melted just enough to turn the yard into a patchwork of ice and mud, the kind that clings to your boots and does not let go. Marin stood on the back steps with her sleeves rolled, hanging damp linens onto the line while the sun blinked weakly through a thin veil of clouds. Tally was inside, pale but healing. Her laugh not quite back to full strength, but alive again in flickers. The cat had taken up permanent residence under the kitchen stove, as if guarding her. Marin's fingers worked on autopilot, clothespins clicking into place, breath visible in the cold. She should have felt settled, grateful. The girl was safe. The storm had passed, but something in her chest still buzzed, like the stillness could not be trusted. She did not hear Caleb approach until the snow crunched beneath his boots. Afternoon, he said, tipping his hat with that calm steadiness that always felt earned, never performed. Hey, she replied, surprised by the way her voice softened around him. He held something behind his back. If that is another sack of potatoes, I'm going to start charging you storage. He grinned, then revealed what he was holding. A small wooden box, hand-carved, no stain, but sanded smooth. Inside were seed packets, dozens of them. Thought you might want to say in what grows come spring? Marin blinked. You brought me seeds. You said you used to garden back east. Figured you might again. She took the box, gently running her fingers over the worn edge of the lid. Where did you get these? Some were my wife's. The rest I have traded for over the years. Have not had much reason to plant them. Marin looked up, caught the pause in his voice. But now you do. He nodded. I am offering you work. Come spring, I will need help with the east pasture. Repairs on the north fence, and the garden is yours if you want it. Fair pay, meals included, no strings. Her heart caught on the last words. No strings. I will not ask for what you do not offer freely. Marin stepped down into the slush, boots sinking slightly, the wooden box still in her hands. You always that careful with your words? Only when they matter. She studied his face, weathered, open, tired in a way that told the truth. A man who had lost things, who was not trying to fill the hole, just grow around it. I do not need rescue, Caleb. I know. I am not sure what I need yet. Sometimes what you need is not rescue, it is room to grow. Marin smiled, then slow and real. You practiced that line? Nope, it just came out crooked. They both laughed, and it was not nervous. It was clean. She looked down at the box again, then nodded. All right, I will take the work. He did not press for more, just stepped back with a satisfied nod and turned to go. As he left, Tally appeared at the window, one cheek pressed against the glass, watching like she had known all along something was shifting. Later over dinner, Marin told Leona about the offer. Honest work, she said. Land to tend. A garden. Leona did not speak at first, just sipped her tea. You think I am being foolish? Marin asked. No, Leona said. I think you are being careful, which is smarter than foolish if you ask me. I do not know what it is between us. It does not have to be something right away. Maybe it just becomes. Marin nodded, grateful. That night, she opened the seed box again and spread the packets out on the table. Carrots, onions, beans, squash, and tucked beneath them a single folded note in Caleb's handwriting. Things worth growing take time. She smiled, touching the edge of the paper. In the weeks that followed, the days began to stretch longer. The snow melted slower than anyone liked, but it melted all the same. Marin started helping at the chapel pantry twice a week, and Leona let her take over baking for the market table. Her loaves sold fast. Word was spreading. Tally's color came back. She started asking questions again, drawing pictures of gardens and horses and what a house might look like if it were half built of pie. And every few days, Caleb came by, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing at all. Once he brought nails for the pantry shelves and stayed to hammer them in without asking permission. Another time, he just sat on the porch steps sipping coffee while Marin hung laundry, not saying much, just existing near her. It was not courting, not quite. It was steadier than that. Then one evening, as the light faded behind the hills and the air smelled of thawed earth, Sister Miriam stopped by. She came with a letter in hand and that familiar, unreadable look on her face. It is from Elias, she said, handing it over. Seems he has not quite finished making noise. Marin took the letter, her fingers colder now than they had been in the snow. She opened it carefully, reading the contents aloud. The Crow estate is being reevaluated. Our family requests you cease any claim or suggestion that your name entitles you to inheritance, property, or reputation within the community of Red Bluff. If these conditions are not respected, further legal action will follow. Signed formally, with a stamp of ink that made it feel heavier than it should. He is pushing, Marin said quietly. Leona stepped forward. He is hoping you will bend. I will not, Marin said. Not for him. Caleb's voice sounded from behind them, quiet but certain. Then let us remind him you are not alone. They all turned. He was standing on the edge of the porch, arms folded, face unreadable, not offering protection, offering presence. Marin folded the letter, placed it beside the seed box, and nodded once. All right, she said, let us begin planting. Spring arrived, and Marin began working the land at Caleb's ranch. But as she planted new roots, Elias returned with legal threats and quiet rumors, pushing the town to take sides. And someone unexpected from Marin's past arrived in Red Bluff with a different version of her story. I thought I buried who I was, but I see now I just planted her. The soil came alive with the first real thaw. It was not much to look at, clumpy, stubborn, cold in the mornings. But by late March, it started to give under the weight of a spade. Marin pressed her boot into the shovel's edge, lifting the top layer of earth, exhaling when it broke apart in her hands like crumbled cake. Caleb's east garden had been a patch of grass and rocks for years. Now it was sectioned off with twine and wooden stakes, lines etched with chalk and the faint scent of new beginning in the air. Tally helped where she could, mostly by rearranging pebbles into pretend fences and singing nonsense songs to the worms. Caleb worked nearby, reinforcing the old fence, sleeves rolled, arms dirt-streaked, quiet in the way that made space for others. Marin planted the onions first. Something about their quiet strength felt right. You look like you have done this 100 times, Caleb said from the gate. Only 23, she replied. Last one was in a city courtyard. Took me all season just to get 3 tomatoes. He smiled. I would take 3 honest tomatoes over a bushel of borrowed ones. She dusted her hands on her apron, standing to stretch. "This feels good," she said, surprising even herself, "because it is yours," he replied. Marin nodded. "I thought I buried who I was, but I see now I just planted her." The wind stirred the twine. Somewhere overhead, geese called as they moved north again. Later that afternoon, after a lunch of leftover stew and warm biscuits, Caleb returned to the pasture, and Marin walked back toward town to check on Leona and bring Tally home. The path was soft now, less snow, more mud, easier to lose yourself in the rhythm of walking. She was not expecting Sister Miriam on the porch. The nun stood straight-backed, coat unbuttoned, holding something in her hands. A letter. "No." "Two." "Trouble?" Marin asked. "Maybe," Miriam said. "Depends on how well you have made peace with your past." Marin's stomach dropped. She took the envelopes, thumbing them open without ceremony. One was from a law office in Billings. Curt, formal, laced with polite threat. Elias Crow's name appeared 3 times in the first paragraph alone. The second was worse. It was not a letter at all. It was a newspaper clipping. East Coast paper. Smudged print. But the headline was clear. "Missing heiress leaves case behind. Family alleges fraud. Desertion." Beneath it, a grainy image. Her face, not quite current, not quite past, somewhere in between. A moment caught mid-turn, eyes cast sideways, hair tucked under a plain hat. The blood drained from her cheeks. Miriam's voice was low. "Someone mailed this directly to Ruth Fenley's store. Anonymous return address. No note." Marin folded the paper slowly. "It started then. They are trying to push you out without touching you. Character first. Reputation second. That is how they do it," Marin muttered. "They will not stop unless you draw a line. And you cannot do that quietly." That night she brought the clipping to Caleb. He read it twice, jaw tight. "Is it true?" he asked, voice steady. "Some of it," Marin said, "enough to sting." Caleb waited. "My family was old money," she explained. "Not as grand as they wanted folks to believe, but the kind of old that came with expectations. My mother died young. My father drank too much. I was set to marry someone who wanted the last name. Not the girl." Caleb stayed silent, not pushing. "I ran," she said. "I left it all. My aunt told everyone I had snapped, said I took valuables, lied. Let the rumor work for her. She wanted control of what little was left. Did you take anything?" "Only the train fare," she said. "The rest. That is their shame, not mine." Caleb nodded, quiet again. "You want to know the worst part?" she asked. Blinking back heat. "It worked. They buried me in gossip so deep I started to believe I deserved it." He stepped closer. "You do not. I know that now. But knowing does not make it stop." "No," he said, "but standing your ground does." The next day, Marin walked into town alone. She passed Ruth Fenley, who looked away too fast. The Harper boys stopped talking as she approached. Even Big Tom fumbled his words, unsure whether to ask or ignore. She did not flinch. She went straight to the notice board outside the chapel, the one where folks posted birth announcements, lost dogs, and the odd request for pie donations. She pinned the article to it, and beside it, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "My name is Marin Whitlow. I came here to marry Jeremiah Crow. I stayed because I found something better. A life built, not borrowed. A home earned, not given. The truth has traveled slower than the lie. But it is here now, and I am not leaving." She stepped back, took a breath. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. "Ruth," Marin turned, eyes steady. "I did not post it," Ruth said, "but I did not stop it either. I figured." Ruth shifted, guilt pulling at her face. "You are braver than I gave you credit for." "I am just done hiding." Ruth looked away, then nodded. "If you need extra jars this season, I have got plenty." It was not an apology, but it was something. Marin walked back to Caleb's ranch with her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the first shoots in the garden peeked through, Caleb handed her a cup of coffee. "You really posted it?" he asked. "Front and center," he smiled. "You scared half the town." "Good. They needed waking up." Tally ran by, chasing the cat, giggling like nothing had ever gone wrong in the world. And for the first time, Marin let herself believe she was not just surviving anymore. She was growing. With Elias publicly outmaneuvered, Red Bluff began to shift. Some neighbors reached out, others retreated. But the biggest surprise came when a figure from Marin's past arrived in town. Charlotte Everly. She had been Marin's closest friend once, more like a sister than anything blood had ever given her. Loyal, sharp-tongued, beautiful in a way that made doors open and men hesitate, and dangerous in the way only someone who knows all your truths can be. Marin, Charlotte said softly, standing on Leona's porch, travel wrinkled, no jewelry, hair tucked, tight. You are really here. Marin stood with her arms folded, unsure what to say. I did not come to cause a stir, Charlotte said. I just needed to see for myself. See what? If you were still you. Marin let out a dry breath. That is rich. I know. I deserve worse. Then get to it. Charlotte's voice cracked. I did not help you, not when I should have. I watched them tear you down. Let them do it if I am honest. Told myself I could not risk my own name, my job, my place. You were right to be angry, Marin said. That is exactly what you did. I know. Then why now? Charlotte sat back down slowly, hands in her lap. Because I am tired of the wait. And because I know something you might need. She pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket and held it out. Inside was a single page, a notarized copy of a ledger from the Whitlow family's trust. It clearly showed the misappropriation of funds, not by Marin, but by her uncle and aunt. Dated, signed, filed in secret. I kept it, Charlotte said. I always meant to, but I did not have the courage. Marin looked up, stunned. This does not clear everything, Charlotte added, but it makes them pause, gives you room to breathe. Why give it to me now? Charlotte stared out toward the hills. Because some ghosts do not haunt. They just come back to see if you are still afraid. I needed to see that you are not. Marin felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the weight of resentment loosened. I am not afraid anymore, she said. Charlotte gave a small nod, her eyes glassy. Then I will go. And just like that, Charlotte walked down the porch steps and toward the station. No drama, no demands, just history. That night, Marin stood under the eaves holding the ledger copy in one hand, watching the rain come in soft waves across the yard. Caleb found her there. Stranger in town? He asked. A memory, she said, dressed in a long coat. You all right? She looked at him, the document folded in her palm. I think so. I think I just put a chapter to rest. Later that week, a final letter arrived from Philadelphia. The Crow estate had been divided. Elias had withdrawn his claims. If Marin signed a settlement, she would receive enough money to live comfortably for years. But there was a condition. Her name would not appear in any record. No mention of relation to the family, no public acknowledgement, as if she had never existed to them. Caleb read the letter. You could take it, he said, buy land, build that pie-shaped house Tally talks about. But you would never really be free of it. No, so what do you want to do? Marin did not answer right away. That night, she walked out alone. Following the fence line to the fire pit Caleb had built near the far oak, she lit a small flame, fed it kindling. The fire crackled to life, soft and honest. Then she held the letter out over it. You do not have to carry the fire that burned you, she whispered, and let go. The paper curled, blackened, vanished. Not in anger, not in grief, in relief. The walls went up in late May. It was not much yet, just a rectangular outline of fresh timber on the far side of the house, beside the garden where the carrots had finally started to cooperate. But to Marin, it looked like the future. Framed in sunlight and sawdust, Caleb was at the edge of the clearing with a measuring stick and a pencil tucked behind his ear. This will be the new kitchen, he said, running a hand along the top beam. Bigger table, room for more feet under it. And more mouths to feed, Marin added, carrying over a basket of nails. You planning on adopting half the town? Only the troublemakers. Tally will be thrilled. He looked at her, eyes soft. You sure about all this? I am more than sure. She was not just building a room, she was building a life. And this time it was not for someone else's approval or reputation. It was for the people who showed up when everything fell apart. For the girl who once arrived off a train with a broken heart and nowhere to sleep. For the child who had lost her mother's attention and found a new one in the garden rows. For the man who never asked her to change, but helped her find her way back to who she always was. By noon, the neighbors began to arrive. First Leona carrying a tin of berry hand pies, then Big Tom and his oldest son with a borrowed wagon full of lumber. Sister Miriam brought lemonade and a few jokes sharper than the saw blades. Even Ruth Fenley came, hair tied back, offering up a hand-stitched curtain and a quiet smile. No one said it aloud, but it felt like a raising, not just of walls, but of community. Every nail driven into the wood was a memory. Every plank lifted was a piece of something broken being made whole again. By evening, the sun hung low and golden over Red Bluff. The new frame cast shadows like a finished home. People lingered longer than necessary, no one in a rush to leave. Marin stood near the porch, watching the small crowd, her heart impossibly full. It was not perfect, it never would be. There were still days when the past tugged at her sleeve, when old ghosts whispered. But the difference now was simple. She did not listen. As the last of the helpers headed home, Caleb wrapped his arm gently around her waist. "You tired?" "Exhausted," she said, leaning into him, but proud. "So much I can hardly hold it." They stayed like that until the first stars blinked above. Later that night, inside the warm glow of the old kitchen, Marin sat with Tally at the table. The girl had fallen asleep with her head on a book. Smudged drawings of chickens and garden fences scattered around her. Caleb was nearby, sorting tools, humming something under his breath. Marin looked around and let it settle. The stillness, the warmth, the earned peace. This was what healing looked like. Not grand or dramatic, just steady, quiet, real. She reached for a scrap of paper and wrote a single sentence. It did not end with escape. It began with staying. She folded it and tucked it into the back of the family Bible, nestled between birth records and pressed flowers, because someday someone would want to know how it all started, and the answer would not be in the scandal or the headlines or the letters never answered. It would be here, in the dirt-streaked floorboards, in the porch swing that creaked under late-night talks, in the calloused hands that built something better out of what was left, in the quiet revolution of a woman choosing to stay. Tally stirred, eyes half open. "Is this what home feels like?" she asked sleepily. Marin looked around, the garden, the porch, the man beside her, the quiet, the breath in her chest that did not shake. "Yes," she said softly, "I think it is." This story was never about a runaway bride. It was about what happens after the running stops, about how love, when it is real, does not try to fix you. It gives you the space to grow into yourself, about how you can survive the worst version of your past and still write something new. And most of all, about how home is not something you find. It is something you build, nail by nail, row by row, truth by trembling, brave truth. Until one day you wake up and realize you are no longer surviving. You are living. You are home.